I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. It's my great pleasure to introduce the Tobacco Centers of Regulatory Science speaker for today, Dr. John Samet. John is a distinguished professor and chair of the Department of Preventive Medicine at USC Keck School of Medicine. And he's also the founding director of the USC Institute for Global Health. He's a pulmonary physician and epidemiologist, and has conducted seminal, really important research on the health risks of inhaled pollutants. He has looked at both particulates and ozone in outdoor air and indoor pollutants, including secondhand smoke and radon. When I was preparing for for today, I found this quote on a website that I thought really exemplified John, and I wanted to read this out to you. It talks about him and his work ethic, and it says, "He's a man driven to make a difference in the health of individuals and whole communities. In his 30 years of scientific research, he has pursued new discoveries to improve environmental health and preventive medicine. At the same time, he has worked tirelessly to provide service that improves public health." And I think this is so true of John. In fact, he has received the Surgeon General's Medallion in 1990 and 2006. This is an award which is given for exceptional achievement to the cause of public health and medicine. And he received these awards for his work as a senior scientific editor on multiple influential Surgeon General reports on tobacco and public health. He has also received numerous other awards that I'm not going to go through all of them. But in his service to public health, he has also chaired several really important public health committees. This includes the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee of the EPA and the Tobacco Products Scientific Advisory Committee of the FDA. And this is where I first met him. And while I have learned a lot from him about tobacco and public health, I think what I have always been struck by is his kindness and his willingness to address and answer every small question, no matter how stupid or small it is. And I've also been struck by his generosity with his time and the knowledge he has to share. So I welcome you, John, and I look forward to your talk.
Thank you, Suchitra, for a very nice introduction. As some of you will find out when you reach a certain age, you can't tell whether you're being introduced or your obituary is being read. So that was less of an obituary than seems to be happening lately. I think I'll put that down. Let's see, because I want to get off the podium because I can't stand to be up here. So here's what I'm going to talk about: public health impact, and give you an example based around the menthol work done by the Tobacco Products Scientific Advisory Committee. But I want to talk about some important points about how we attribute disease and its causation. Of course, I'm here because President Obama signed the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act in 2009. In fact, how many of you are on TCORS supported? In fact, most of us are here because President Obama signed the 2009 Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act. And that, of course, launched a new approach to tobacco control in this country, as well as a lot of research to address the the FDA's regulatory science needs. So here's what I want to talk about: the idea of attribution and how, in fact, the need to understand the burden of disease caused by smoking made our predecessors think about that issue, how public health impact figures into the Act, the Menthol report as an example, and then some of the looming issues around modified risk products and electronic cigarettes. And if I have time, I'll say a little bit about life working in tobacco control. So let me start with the idea of attribution. So here is Boris Lushniak, interim Surgeon General, when we released the 2014 50th anniversary report. Now, Boris was terrific in releasing the report. He went through each of the major conclusions, and after each one, he said, enough is enough. I don't know if you've watched the webcast of the press conference, but it's worth watching. He was really terrific. And so we're going to get at how do we know what enough is. So here are the major conclusions, and here's the first one. That's, I think, an important statement of causation. Century-long epidemic of cigarette smoking has caused an enormous avoidable public health tragedy. Since the first Surgeon General's report in 1964, more than 20 million premature deaths can be attributed to cigarette smoking. So I'm going to talk about where that number, 20 million, came from. Okay, so that's what we're going to start with in terms of attribution. So I want to get this question of who counts. So I'm going to get off this thing. So about 25 years ago, I was in New Mexico. I was flying back to Albuquerque from somewhere, and I was sitting with a school teacher from Gallup, New Mexico. And we started talking about what he did. He has a really challenging job teaching in Gallup, New Mexico. And I was talking about what I did. And we had this conversation where he said, who counts? Because I've been talking about things like radon and smoking, where we sort of pile up the deaths. And so it came down to, he actually thought there might be an office in Washington where the death certificates came in, and there were little piles or boxes, and somebody looked at it and said, oh, smoking, and put it in the smoking box. And someone else said, oh, radon, put it in the radon box, and then there's another one said, you know, didn't do what your mother told you, or something like that, and put it in that box. So we had this very interesting conversation where it made me think about how we put these numbers out, like literally. So where does 20 million come from? Now, if you're one of my classes, I'd actually make somebody answer the question. And you know, don't worry, I won't. But Suchitra, if you want to, you know, set an example. So this question, or 480,000 deaths a year due to active and passive smoking. So let's talk about a little bit about where these numbers come from. This is really important no matter what you do to understand where these numbers come from. So here we are. This is actually the per capita consumption of cigarettes in the United States across the last century into the start of this one. It's actually pretty interesting. We peaked at about 4,000 cigarettes per person per year, smokers and non-smokers included, about 1962 or 63. That's the peak up there. Now, what's important about 1951? That's when Jerry Cornfield described the calculation of the odds ratio. Okay, so the odds ratio, everybody's heard about odds ratios. It sort of sounds like sort of a funny thing, but you know, it's one of the important statistics we use to estimate effects. And Cornfield described this in 1951. If you read the case control papers, studies published on lung cancer in 1950, they don't calculate a relative risk value. They do a chi-square on a table or something like that, because there was no odds ratio. So why did he do it? Because he wanted to estimate the risk of lung cancer associated with smoking. And here's his table: smokers, non-smokers, and then just the decomposition of the 2x2 table. So one thing we needed was to calculate the strength of the effect of smoking in causing disease. The other big idea was the attributable burden of lung cancer. So that's 1953. And that came from Mort Levin, who had one of the first papers on smoking and lung cancer published in 1950 in JAMA. So the story of Levin's paper is he sent it to JAMA. It was a case control study done at Roswell Park. And the editor of JAMA rejected it because he said it wasn't possible that smoking caused lung cancer. Okay? Soon thereafter, the Winder paper came in with Graham, and he now had two papers, and he published them. And then Dahl and Hill were carrying out their case control study in London, and when these two papers appeared, there were two others actually that year, they pushed forward with publication of their preliminary results in 1950, and then the major case control study came out in 1952. Now, this picture is actually the Hopkins Epi faculty in about 1937 or so. This is Wade Hampton Frost, who was the first academic epidemiologist appointed in 1918 at Hopkins. So Levin published this, which has over here what we would now call the attributable risk statistic. Okay, so he basically said, I think smoking causes lung cancer. And if a disease is caused by something, there's two things we want to know. How much extra risk there is and how much extra disease is there. So he got it right on the attributable risk statistics. He got it wrong on this, but don't worry. So importantly, behind the idea of the attribution is making a comparison to something. Okay, so if we want to think about how much disease is caused by smoking, what would we want to compare it to? Now that's an easy question. Suchitra, what do you want to compare it to? The world without smoking. The world without smoking. Right. The world without smoking. So the comparison, to go back to humans, is the counterfactual comparison. So you're making a comparison of what the world is as it exists to the world that doesn't exist, the counterfactual world. Now, I always explain this with sports, because in sports, sportscasters thrive on the counterfactual, right? You know, it would be sort of like Yale would have beaten Harvard if they hadn't fumbled the ball 5 times. Okay, there's a counterfactual game that didn't exist. So here's a great example out of the Baltimore Sun. You just can't do better than this. It was a close call, but if they had made the 3 field goals they missed and gotten a few other breaks, they would have been sailing into the 4th quarter with a safe lead. So you should have the idea of the counterfactual now. It's making a comparison of something that doesn't, the real world, to something that doesn't actually exist. So for smoking, the real comparison we want to make is the world without smoking, which is a theoretically achievable world, right? Let me give you a different example. Just think about it. Don't worry, I'm not going to ask you this one. So if thinking about obesity, what would be a counterfactual? Is it a world in which no one has a BMI greater than 25? That's not achievable. What if could you truncate the distribution of BMI at 25? We'd have to get rid of professional football. Maybe a good thing, but that's a counterfactual that's not achievable. Okay, so we hope that a counterfactual of no smoking is in fact achievable. So here is the simple formula that makes a lot of sense. The attributable risk, in its simplest form, is just the relative risk minus 1, which is the baseline, times the prevalence of whatever the exposure is. So think about for lung cancer, let's say, I'll make it up. Prevalence is 30%. The relative risk is 20. So it's 0.3 times 19, which is 5.7 over 1 plus 5.7. So it gets you about 85%, right? So it's a simple formula conceptually, and there's different variants and more complicated ways to get at this. But if you look at the numbers in the Surgeon General's report, we calculate them based on this general idea. So coming out of the early days of tobacco came the relative risk, the odds ratio as an approximation, the ability to estimate the effect, and then the idea of attribution. Now, I just want to throw in that this sort of permeates a lot of our thinking and decision making as we do risk assessment in support of both federal, that's Washington, and state and local site management and other kinds of issues. And just another important report relevant to public health impact is this book called the Red Book, because of its color, published in 1983, that was an effort to harmonize risk assessment across the federal government. And it said that when we want to assess risks, we want to know whether something causes disease, how risk relates to dose, how many people are exposed, and then we want to put that together into a risk characterization that says what is the burden, where are the uncertainties. So, for example, 20 years ago, I was very involved in the indoor radon controversy. We spent a lot of time doing just this for radon, and this still figures very much into government-wide decision making. Just another arbitrary historical fact. It was chaired by an epidemiologist, this committee, Stoney Stallings, who was the founding dean at UT Houston. If you go read in the International Journal of Epidemiology within the year, you'll see an interesting story of how it was Stallings who penned the original Surgeon General's criteria. And there's a commentary there by his daughter, who's an epidemiologist at Colorado State. So you may want to go back and look at that. So we use these approaches to produce this estimate of population disease risk to look at population impact. And you might think, for example, about electronic cigarettes in this kind of framework, which we're going to do in a bit. And then this framework has been modified. So if the last one was the red book, we're now up to the silver book in 2007. And continuing to reframe how to use impact in making decisions. And this basically says, define the problem, think about what decision makers need, and feed the information in a useful way. And key in all of this is uncertainty. Okay, it's what we don't know. And these exercises are useful for sort of framing what we know and then separating out what we don't know. Our job in the TCORS is to address uncertainties. And when we get these little lists of things that, from FDA that say, here are our research priorities, they correspond to uncertainties for which we are supposed to be addressing, developing evidence. Okay, so uncertainty and then knowledge. And much of the play in tobacco control historically has been the industry's efforts to create uncertainty and create doubt. And this is just a few of the books. There's many, but I would highlight, if you haven't read Naomi Oreskes and Conway's book and seen the documentary, the movie, you really should. You might show that at your TCORS. The movie starts with Stan Glantz and sort of goes on from there. But again, the tobacco industry going back into the early 50s took on this strategy of doubt creation, sort of understanding this play between evidence and uncertainty in making decisions. They became the masters of it. And those who did it with them and for them, Hill and Knowlton, the advertising firm, the many experts who they signed up to cast doubt, those tactics have spread to climate change, to chemical risks, and so on. So I think it's important to understand how this has been played out. One book I don't have here that I should is The Golden Holocaust by Robert Proctor at Stanford. And again, sort of one of the best and liveliest histories of the tobacco epidemic based on the documents. Okay, so let's go to this attribution impact in the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act now. So this is out of the act, public health impact. So this is language that everybody involved in the TCORS needs to know. Risks and benefits to the population as a whole, okay, critical notion, including users and non-users of tobacco products. So in thinking about public health impact of tobacco products, we need to think about existing users and those who are not using but could. And again, in the e-cigarette, controversy is the wrong word. I'll say in the e-cigarette noise, you see those who are focused here and those who are focused here without really thinking about this issue of integrated impact. Now, how do we get at impact? We use models. Okay, we say, here's how the world works, and if we perturb the world with a new product, what will happen? Okay, so models are just made up views of how the world works. We may frame them in statistical terms, we may use them totally qualitatively, but if we're doing this quantitatively, then we use research results to estimate the different parameters in the models. And these models have a long trajectory of use in tobacco. I mean, just as an example, Ken Warner and David Mendez at the University of Michigan, probably for 25 years, have based a lot of their work and policy analysis around what are actually relatively straightforward models. And I won't go into the details, but here's the world, smokers, non-smokers, here's different policy options, and here's what happens in the end to mortality under different options. So you can make comparisons. Here's the world as it is. Here's the world if we raise the tobacco tax to $10 across the country per pack. Okay, so models are key, and at least in the case of this model, it's been around a long time and fits pretty well to existing data. And for some of these parameters in this kind of model, smoking-disease relationships, we have very good information and lots of it. So we can do these models with reasonable certainty. David Levy has published hundreds of papers using his model. SimSmoke, which is a policy analysis model, where you can look at the impact of different policy changes and in the end look at smoking attributable mortality and project these out into the future using changing demographics. SysNet, some of that work done here at Yale. In fact, again, another example of a population-based model with some important papers on lung cancer in recent years. For those of you wanting more of this, if you go to the 2014 Surgeon General's report online, in addition to the 1,000 pages where there are web supplements, and there's a very nice primer on modeling and use in tobacco that David Mendez wrote. So I would suggest that if you want more, you can go there and find out about agent-based models, for example, and other kinds of models. So take a look at this, because these are the tools that we use to estimate impact. Okay, and again, I'm going to show you the example. So these are key. Here's a whole bunch of different models. CDC uses the SAMIC, not the Samet model, the SAMIC model, smoking attributable mortality, morbidity, and economic costs, okay, which periodically gets tuned up, and there are others. So something you need to know about, because this is how we get to population impact. Now, George Box was a statistician, did a lot of actually longitudinal analysis. There are these famous quotes from him, but the bottom line is this one: all models are wrong, but some are useful. So again, we're framing the world. We're saying, here's how the world works. And since we don't exactly know how the world works, we have to be wrong. But the question is, does it matter? And if we're using a model that's a little bit off, but we're using the same way and comparing policy scenarios, so what? So remember, we have to be a little bit humble about these, but they're very useful tools, better expressed in, from a long time ago now, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. So we have to recognize what it is we know and what we don't know. So let me go to an example now, the Menthol report. So this is again out of the Act. Secretary shall establish this 12-member advisory committee to be known as the Tobacco Products Scientific Advisory Committee, which quickly became known as TPSAC. And I was the original chair of TPSAC and chaired it until some very complicated things started happening, and we can come back to that if there's time. But our first task was to look at the menthol issue. Okay, so menthol was the only flavoring, characterizing flavor allowed to persist after the Act, in the Act. Okay, and why was it allowed to persist? Because Lorillard, not allowed to make menthol, cigarettes would have gone out of business. So it was 80+% of their business. Of course, dominant marketing to African Americans, but it was at least a third probably of the tobacco market. So this was not included, not prohibited under the Act, and our charge was to look at the impact of the use of menthol in cigarettes on the public health, including such use among children, African Americans, Hispanics, and other racial and ethnic minorities. Excuse me, I'm just going to find my water up here. So we were given that task and a year to complete it, okay, which was not very long in committee years, I can assure you. So we set out to do that. So menthol was important, of course, with this interesting history. Does anybody know how menthol cigarettes were discovered? No. You have to go read Robert Proctor's book. So this guy named Spud put his cigarettes into a little tin in which he had some menthol and discovered that the mentholated cigarettes from sitting in the tin had this nice, cool thing. And he went into business. So that was where the original menthol cigarette came from. This is late 20s, so here are some spuds. And then, of course, this targeted marketing, Newport, Pleasure, the marketing to African American markets in particular, the use of increasing amounts of menthol, the finding that new initiators were more likely to turn to menthol cigarettes because of the cooling. There's some complicated pharmacology there. And many look to this as sort of one of the successes of the advertising industry. Now these products where you can crush a capsule and sort of mentholate the cigarette at the end, and sort of obviously marketing of image here. So here's FDA about to then launch itself and this first task of examining menthol. So here is the call, and here's our date, our 1 year. And I have to say, when we had our first committee meeting, and I'm sitting there as chair thinking, basically, how are we going to get this done in a year and estimate public health impact? I think over the year we had 8 committee meetings in a year, plus multiple, sort of small subcommittees doing additional work. So the menthol report addressed these issues, that the charge around public health impact and the effects on adolescents. The issue of contraband came up. Tobacco industry consultants and others raised the question of, if menthol were removed, there would be such a demand for menthol cigarettes that there would be enormous smuggling and contraband, which seemed implausible, but this was raised. That continues to be raised as an issue. So what do? We set up a model, okay? And this was the model that we arrived at. So we said that youth adolescents would experiment. Some of them would go on and initiate regular smoking. There would be menthol smokers and non-menthol smokers. Some would become addicted. Some would quit. Some would continue. From their smoking, they would get doses of toxins that cause disease and death. So that was our simple model. Numbers correspond to points where we asked questions. Does industry marketing entice new smokers to use menthol cigarettes? Are there differences in dose of carcinogens, for example, comparing menthol smokers to non-menthol smokers? Does the availability of menthol increase the likelihood of moving from experimentation to initiation? And then what we did is we did literature reviews corresponding to each of the numbers, which became chapters. So we used a framework to organize. Okay, now I'd like to say that somebody just sat down and drew out this framework and then we all got to work, but that's not the way these things happen. And the minute you draw a picture, somebody says it's the wrong picture. And of course, since there's no right picture, you have to look at this until finally sort of pragmatically say, okay, this will work. And this did. So I'm going to just show you what the report was about. We talked about what we did, the effects of menthol, patterns of menthol, marketing, the effects of menthol on initiation, addiction, and cessation, disease risks, and then conclusions and recommendations. So one critical concept we sort of pulled out of the clinical trials literature, is the idea of equipoise. So this is a fancy word for saying, where does the evidence stand? Is it in balance? Equipoise, so our clinical trialist colleagues talk about equipoise, that it's justifiable to do a trial on something if the evidence hangs in the balance. If you know it goes one way or the other, then you shouldn't do the trial. So we use this as the balancing point for our judgments on where the evidence stood on these different questions. So just for example, does availability of menthol cigarettes increase the likelihood of experimentation? Does the availability of menthol cigarettes increase the likelihood of becoming a regular smoker? So we made these judgments on where the evidence stood because these would then correspond to the points in our model. So for example here, a conclusion that a relationship is more likely than not that the availability of menthol cigarettes increases experimentation and regular smoking. So above equipoise. In other words, there's an adverse consequence for health impact of menthol here. So what we tried to do is frame all of this in a transparent way using standard terminology. In doing this, I borrowed a lot from what we've done in the Surgeon General's reports, where we again tried to use standard language. So these next bunches of slides, which I'm not going to dwell on too much, just go through what our literature reviews found on these different questions corresponding to the numbers in the framework. So here you can see above equipoise, below equipoise, above, at, below, etc. And overall, does the availability of menthol cigarettes increase the prevalence of smoking in the population? Above equipoise. And tobacco industry marketing, at equipoise, below equipoise. This is particular groups. So we then said, okay, we've done our literature review, we have a model. Now let's model population health impact. And we brought David Mendez at the University of Michigan in with a crunch assignment of doing all this modeling in a couple of months, which he did. So here's the menthol model, which was an adaptation of the Michigan model to essentially have the different compartments in it related to menthol I showed you originally. So this is his model, and anybody who wants more details, it's all in the TPSAC report. And then we pulled out what likely parameters corresponded to these different points in the model based on our literature review. And we gave a range and then our best estimate of what these parameters were. Then we ran the model to look at the extra burden, the burden of disease, the population impact. These are the numbers. I'm not going to tell you a single one of them. And here's our conclusion. Okay, so menthol cigarettes have an adverse impact on public health in the US. There are no public health benefits of menthol compared to non-menthol cigarettes. So that's where the TPSAC recommendations, our overall findings, went in this report. Now, what is missing from this? What didn't we say? Did we tell FDA what it should do? Did we say menthol should be removed from cigarettes? No. So there was a fair amount of discussion on this point. I've said we're the Tobacco Products Scientific Advisory Committee and not the Policy Committee, because there's a number of policy options that could be pursued in relationship to this point. This, to me, says do something. It doesn't say what. If you go back and read the 1964 Surgeon General report, it says that tobacco smoking is a sufficient cause of disease to promote remedial action. It does not say here's what the action should be. So again, this is a question that sort of speaks to the heart of what the TCORS do. We provide science in support of the FDA and potentially other regulatory missions. We're not necessarily the policy advisors. So that's where we drew the line. And there's this recommendation, removal would benefit. But we don't, again, say do that. So we came up with research recommendations having done all this work. And here's more in the report. Here's a little bit of the press afterwards. This is Bopper Deaton, who was the first head of CTP, now replaced by Mitch Zeller. And this is me pontificating. This is the Los Angeles Times, a lot of discussion. Wall Street Journal, we didn't find increased disease risk. They picked on this, criticized menthol cigarettes. Now, this was interesting. So I didn't quite understand this, but a lot of people were coming to the TPSAC meeting, all these people in suits. So there were two kinds. So one tribe that lives in suits is lawyers, right? So there were a lot of that tribe there. Another is stock analysts. Okay, so there are all these people who track the stock market, of course, and they're tobacco specialists. And they would come up to me after we'd have these meetings, and they come and say, well, Dr. Samet, what is TPSAC going to do? You know, I'm working with such and such, and we try to decide about our stock recommendation. I go, give me a break. You know, I'm hardly going to reveal what I think TPSAC might do to stock analysts. But in any case, this to me was fascinating. Okay, so here is the report, before the report released, and here's a day later. Okay, and you might notice, you know, if you had bought back here, you know, it just keeps going up, and that's true historically as well. So why did it go up? It's because we didn't say ban. Okay, it's because we didn't say ban. Had a little exchange about this in the New England Journal. So Neil Benowitz, a TPSAC member, of course, and well known, I'm sure, to everybody in this room, and I wrote this piece in the New England Journal, and here is Michael Siegel, who probably many of you know because he sends out an email every day, today about our new paper in pediatrics, in fact, describing some perceived fault on the part of the scientific community, suggesting that this was a lost opportunity. And again, this was sort of the polls of what to do about this. So let me move on then to talk about this idea of public health impact and what else it extends to. So we dealt in, our next task at TPSAC was to deal with dissolvables. We did a similar exercise, far simpler because essentially there were no data. These were these kinds of products, which I don't think have found much market traction so far. And so we had to do a report, and here again is a little bit of press. This did not receive a great deal of interest, but more challenging for the future for FDA potentially is the modified risk tobacco products. And this is something that a tobacco manufacturer can file for a claim for a modified risk or modified exposure product. They have to deal with this overall population impact issue. So the first product that has, for which an application has been filed is snus, Swedish Match, filed an application which was probably reviewed by TPSAC a year ago, roughly a year ago, and for which a decision is not yet out. Now, then we come to electronic cigarettes. I was in a session at the American Thoracic Society in May. It was a whole panel on tips on electronic cigarettes. And Alona Jaspers, who's at the UNC Medical School TCORS, gave a presentation in which she compared gene transcription in the nose between people who used electronic cigarettes and people who used combustible cigarettes. So let me say this again. She looked at transcription of genes, the so-called transcriptome, wow, in the nose for users of combustible cigarettes versus e-cigarettes. And the idea being she thinks with some basis that gene expression in the nose may follow what is going on in the lung. I sort of was at the end of this session, and one of my comments was, who would have imagined, it was 40 years since I'd gone to my first ATS meeting, that we would be standing there talking about transcription in the nose in people who smoke regular cigarettes versus people using an electronic product that makes a vapor. I mean, were we paying attention to electronic cigarettes 10 years ago? No, that's about the first time I heard of them, right? They came out of China around 10 years ago. And I thought, who would ever use such a product? I've been wrong about many things. So in any case, it appears that there is. And now, you know, a lot of our work in our TCORS is directed at these. And of course, there's all this wonderful advertising. We did CDC grand rounds on electronic cigarettes last October. You have to go look at Matt Meyer's presentation. I mean, he just pulled some spectacular stuff, some so graphic that we had a big discussion about whether even to show it in the CDC grand rounds, the sexual imagery that was being used, and decided since it was public that it was okay to show it. But this could be a Virginia Slims ad from 30 years ago. The targeted marketing to different population segments, selling it with sex, and then of course this, and that was one of the original marketing ploys. And in many of our cities in LA, we worked very closely with the city because they had to change the ordinances because electronic cigarettes were not covered as a product. So in thinking about this, you have to go back to public health impact, and you have to look at potential harms and potential benefits. And I think what's happened in this so-called electronic cigarette debate or controversy, which to me is a controversy or debate that shouldn't exist because it's not really about science, but it's about sort of deeply held beliefs on the part of a relatively small number of individuals. Some focus on the current benefits, potential benefits for current smokers. Okay, and the recent Royal College of Physicians reports would fit right in there. Others are concerned about the potential harms, particularly for youth. Okay, so in terms of overall public health impact, let's say I have research and I come up with the following. For every additional life year saved for current smokers, 2 new adolescents will become nicotine addicted. Is that a good trade-off? Let me give you another one. Let's say that for every 10 years of added life for smokers, 0.5 new nicotine addicts are created among youth. Is that a good trade-off? These are rhetorical questions, by the way. I'm not asking anybody, but if anybody has an answer, chime in. But the point actually is, do we have an exchange for this risk trade-off? Youth versus older addicted smokers? I don't actually think so. I mean, this is a great example of a risk trade-off where you would be perhaps providing a benefit to this group while harming this group. I don't think as a society we would actually tolerate harming youth to help addicted smokers. I don't think, if it were framed that way. But I've really not seen, I have to say, a proper framing of this issue. But this is how we lined it up. Okay, the benefits and to whom they accrue, and the harms and to whom they may accrue. We anticipated this a little bit in the 2014 Surgeon General's report in sort of charting out the potential impact of non-combustible products. And I think what was important, I'll come to this in a minute. Let me skip ahead real quick. What was important is that we said the burden comes from cigarettes and other combusted products. So that's true. And getting rid of them is important, reducing use. But that there really has to be an overall strategy, a nicotine management strategy, that we don't have. I mean, in fact, if you look at it in the US, there are multiple stakeholders in sort of the nicotine world. FDA is really only one. FDA is really only one. So we need a comprehensive nicotine policy. So let me go back then to sort of this and the so-called, I like her, don't you? She was even on TV for a while. But this debate about this. So this is the Royal College of Physicians report that just came out. And if you haven't looked at it, you need to. Okay? And the prior report of Public Health England. So there's a need for regulation to reduce direct and indirect adverse effects of e-cig use. They talk about harm reduction and the importance of these products. And they say in the interest of public health, it is important to promote the use of e-cigs, NRT, and other non-tobacco nicotine products as widely as possible. They, in this report, say that it does not seem to be evidence that they're being used by kids. But if you look at the data they actually provide, it in fact counters what they say. The other piece they rely on is this expert judgment exercise on comparative risks of different tobacco products. And some of you may be familiar with this, which is the one that came up with e-cigarettes have only 5% the toxicity of combustible cigarettes. So this group of people got together somewhere and made some judgments on the relative harms. So here's cigarettes at 100, and down here somewhere is electronic cigarettes at 5%. So is there uncertainty here? Is there a lack of knowledge? Is there an understanding of what might happen? Here we are at the start of an epidemic. Imagine a group of people sitting around in 1913 ranking Camel cigarettes against all other products. So this was sort of a bold and poorly interpreted piece of data. Right?
Why is crime a substantial component of that index?
Crime, I don't know. It was a little bit, I mean, they actually used some standard scale, and then they used the weighting, some standard approach, this MCDA approach. Yeah, well, black market illegal is the basis of what it is, but they didn't give it much weight. So in any case, here's this exercise. The other point is, and Public Health England and this group feel that these products are useful for cessation. And I'm sort of in the process of looking at the cessation literature, not from the point of view of what it shows, but the fact that there are now like 6 or 7 systematic reviews of e-cigarettes and cessation. They're basically 2 sort of rigorously done RCTs. Okay, one is Chris Bullen's and the other is the one from Italy. And they don't exactly really get at the right question in any case. So we really don't know, I think, about cessation. But the argument is made, some of it based on rather anecdotal evidence, that it might be useful for cessation. So I think what I'll do, let me stop. The rest of this stuff is my life story. And I was going to talk a little bit about sort of, the consequences of working in tobacco control, but I think I'm going to stop and see if there are questions, because, okay?
Yeah, that sounds perfectly.
Okay, good. So let me stop here. Yeah, thanks.